We generally open our videos with a short intro to the Sydney tram system, mainly in case this is your first time watching the channel, but also because no matter how many times we say it, it's still hard to believe that Sydney, Australia had one of the world's largest and greatest tram systems. With a street distance of nearly 300 kilometres, upon which ran 1,500 trams that completed nearly 1.1 million passenger journeys every day. And it's even harder to believe that we got rid of it all by 1961. Now, the North Sydney lines were an isolated network on the northern side of Sydney Harbour. What makes the North Sydney line so interesting was the number of changes made to the lines over the years, with the largest, of course, being the opening of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And the line that was probably altered the most of all was the Northbridge line, or Suspension Bridge line. So that's what we'll have a look at today. I'm Marty, and welcome to BackTracks. Like many of the transport projects at the turn of last century, it was primarily about creating a transport link so that land could be developed for real estate ventures. And the Suspension Bridge, Northbridge line, was no exception. A bit of the theory of if they build it, they will come. Now, the real hero of this story is the Suspension Bridge. Now, this bridge was opened with much fanfare in 1892. It was the largest of its type in Australia at the time, and the fourth largest in the world. And soon it became a tourist attraction that was featured on postcards and publications of the time. Now, at the start, the bridge was only for pedestrians and no trams crossed. During the 1880s, before the bridge was built, a private company called the North Sydney Tramway and Development Company was formed to sell land and develop the area north of the current bridge, and to build a tram line. But the line was not approved until 1908, and then it was completed in May 1909, but it didn't even cross the bridge, and the terminus was therefore a short distance south. When services commenced, they only ran between Ridge Street and Suspension Bridge. There, passengers had to connect with trams to and from Milsons Point. When the McMahon's Point Wharf and line were open, the Lane Cove and Chatswood services were rerouted to McMahon's Point, which reduced the number of services from Milsons Point coming up Miller Street. So, the line was eventually extended all the way from Suspension Bridge down to Milsons Point. This removed the need for passengers to change trams at Ridge Street. So after Ridge Street, Milsons Point Ferry and Tram Terminal was the original start of the full line. The location is pretty hard to recognise now, as the Harbour Bridge's northern pylon is basically built over the same spot where the ferry tram terminal once was. Now, when the Sydney Harbour Bridge was opened, the North Sydney lines needed to be reorientated from primarily connecting with ferry wharves to lines terminating on the southern side of the harbour at Wynyard. So, from that point on, Northbridge line started at the underground station at Wynyard, platforms 1 and 2, which later became a car park and now are mostly abandoned. Now, if my information's correct, the abandoned platforms can be found behind these doors next to the Coles, which is underneath Wynyard Park. The trams then came out of twin tunnel portals on the eastern side of the bridge. As with the other lines that terminated at Wynyard, the Northbridge line travelled across the eastern side of the deck of the Sydney Harbour Bridge in a separate reservation from road traffic. Now, of note, when they were designing and building the bridge, the original plan was for the bridge to carry 2 separate railway lines, and the trams would just meet trains at North Sydney Station, while the eastern side tracks were to carry train lines to the northern beaches. However, before the bridge was completed, the beaches line was indefinitely postponed, so it was decided to use the lines instead for trams. Once trams reached the northern side of the bridge, they passed Milsons Point tram station and travelled over a dedicated tram bridge to reach North Sydney Station. Only part of the northern approach to that bridge remains today, with most of the bridge demolished during the construction of the Warringah Expressway in the 1960s. After re-entering the road just to the west of North Sydney Station, the line passed the station and turned right into Miller Street. From there, it passed the very busy Mount Street, Miller Street and Longneville Road intersection. Longneville Road is now the Pacific Highway. And here is where trams could continue up to Chatswood and Lane Cove, or go up Miller Street to meet Falcon Street, Military Road, or further on to Northbridge. The line went past the newly constructed MLC Tower, and if you read reports, the soon-to-be demolished MLC Tower. As the line headed north, it passed the site of the former Ridge Street Tram Depot and Cable Winding House. Now, the Ridge Street Tram Depot was originally a cable tram depot which operated from May 1886. Services were extended to Crow's Nest in July 1893, But upon conversion to electric operation in February 1900, the depot was extensively renovated in 1902, increasing its size to 12 tracks. Now, the depot was closed in 1820 and the shed was converted to a cinema, now called the Independent Theatre. So the line continued along Miller Street, crossing over Falcon Street, which carried the cross-network lines from Lane Cove and Chatswood along Military Road to Balmoral Beach, the Zoo and Athol Wharf. It passed Amherst Street, which is just before today's Camaret shops. It avoided the steep part of Miller Street by diverting down Abbott Street, past where North Sydney Leagues Club is today, and onto Vale Street, and then back onto Miller Street as it approached the southern side of the suspension bridge. In 1912, the New South Wales government took over ownership of the bridge following the collapse of that company I talked about earlier, and the government started work on rehabilitating the bridge, and at the time, approval was given to include tram tracks to cross the bridge. Later in 1914, the tracks eventually extended over the bridge and opened for tram traffic in February 1914 to a temporary terminus in Marana Road, Northbridge. And then it was eventually extended all the way to the final terminus in March 1914, with a single track that went along Strathallan Avenue onto Sailor Bay Road to a point beyond Woonona Road near Northbridge Park. The total journey from Milson's Point right through to Northbridge Park took 27 minutes. Back at the time, in 1914, there were only about 100 people and 25 houses in what is now called Northbridge, but then it was called Middle Harbour. Now, it was lucky there weren't that many people living in Northbridge and therefore using the line. Because it was a suspension bridge, there were weight and length restrictions, so only coupled sets of E-Class trams were allowed, with no more than one coupled set at a time or two singles allowed on the bridge at any one time. And because of World War I, housing development north of the bridge was nearly non-existent, and trams were running empty most of the time. Now, thankfully, north of the bridge, the real estate did take off, in part thanks to the bridge and to the tram, and it became a real estate draw card when an eye-catching Hollywoodland-style advertising sign was erected in the rear yard of two houses along the highest point in the 1920s. It only lasted a few years before it was taken down, but nevertheless, it was a tourist draw card. When the Harbour Bridge did open in 1932, passenger numbers increased substantially, and discussion commenced to duplicating the line beyond the suspension bridge to provide a good service frequency. But in the end, what was decided that all services from Wynyard would terminate just at Northbridge Junction, and passengers changed into a single K-Class car operating a shuttle service. This continued until the line was duplicated north of the bridge to Gunya Street. The single line remained across the bridge. The next instalment of the interesting history of this bridge happened in September 1935 when the Main Roads Department took over the bridge. And upon inspection of the bridge, they soon discovered serious faults in the steelworks and the cable. So from 1936, a tram officer was stationed at the bridge to ensure that trams didn't cross with more than the seated number of passengers, and then later police were stationed there to ensure trams and heavy vehicles were not on the bridge at the same time. Now, obviously, this couldn't continue forever, so in May 1936, the bridge was closed. And while the bridge was being repaired, the plan was for travellers to walk across the bridge to two K-Class trams that would be permanently stationed isolated on the north side. But in the end, buses were used instead. Now, the terminus for the tram line was just before the entrance to the bridge. But unfortunately, repairing the bridge proved impractical, and it was decided to replace the whole span with a concrete arch. And no provision was made for the tram line. So when the new bridge opened in September 1939, a direct bus route basically replaced the entire line. But the track and overhead wires actually remained, and with the start of World War II and the associated petrol rationing, trams were reintroduced between Wynyard and the southern side of the bridge in 1941. A dead-end terminus was created in Vale Street, which was just a street away from the original terminus. But after the war, new buses were delivered and the tram service was replaced, and the whole line closed in the early morning of January 11, 1948. So that about wraps it up. A story of a line that crossed 3 bridges, had 9 different termini, opened and closed a number of times, serviced 2 suburbs that both have since changed their name, and that was all in the space of just 30 years of operation. Hope you enjoyed the story of the Northbridge and Suspension Bridge line. Thanks. Thanks for watching, thanks to all the information sources, and hope we'll see you again next time we take a look at the Sydney Tram network on BackTracks.